I'm Noor El-Shidrawi, lead project executive at the Federal Competitiveness and Statistics Authority, and I will be moderating today's panel. Traditionally, most countries in the world did not design public policies with gender equality as a primary consideration. Today, many disparities and inequalities between the sexes appear to have become embedded in public policies and the allocation of public resources. The negative impacts of this legacy are evident across many policy domains, including labor market, education, as well as gender disparities in management and leadership. According to a UN Women report, and as well according to statistics that were shared yesterday at the forum, improved education among women has done little to change occupational segregation in developed and developing countries. The global gender pay gap continues to be 20%. Experts say that it will take us 250 years to close the global gender pay gap. Women remain underrepresented and locked out of decision-making. Globally, in 2018, only 27% of managerial positions in government, large enterprises, and institutions were held by women. The failure to make progress is in direct contradiction to the 2030 Agenda's cardinal principle to leave no one behind. So how can we turn government's political aspirations into a reality? How can governments promote effective gender mainstreaming to catalyze behavior change that will advance gender equality? Enter gender-responsive budgeting, the application of gender mainstreaming in the budgetary process. In today's panel, we will explore together what forms gender budgeting can take, why it's important, and we will learn about countries' experiences in implementing it. Joining me today to explore these topics are two phenomenal women who have dedicated their professional careers to tackling these issues. Zora Khan is the UN Women's Advisor on Policy on Governance and National Planning. She leads the entity's work on gender budgeting, providing technical assistance to over 80 countries on national gender equality plans and strategies. Stefania Fabrizio is the UN chief in the IMF Strategy, Policy and Review Department. Her work focuses extensively on public finance, fiscal institutions, as well as the distributional implications of macroeconomic policies. Zora and Stefania, welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining us today. I think a good place for us to start is if you can tell us, please, how the UN Women and how the IMF believe that gender-responsive budgeting can promote gender equality. What angle specifically are these organizations taking to addressing this topic?
Thank you very much, Noor, for that fantastic question. And at UN Women, we are huge fans of gender-responsive budgeting because we've seen the power of the budget to lead to changes in the lives of women and girls. It's an incredibly important key policy instrument for governments because it determines how countries actually mobilize resources and how they spend resources. And the budget also has broader impacts on the economy at large, so it can either widen or close gender gaps. We say in our work that gender budgets are not about a separate budget for women. So we're not looking at particular expenditure for women's programs, but we're trying to look at the entire budgetary process and assess the extent to which it either advances gender equality goals or holds back our progress towards gender equality. And we know that fiscal authorities in countries have a lot of power because they can either structure their tax and spending in ways that can advance these goals. So we at UN Women, we define gender budgeting as a process for integrating gender equality objectives into the public policy cycle, from planning all the way through to the evaluation of impact. And today we have over 100 countries supporting some kind of gender budgeting initiative around the world. And these are both in advanced and in developing countries. So it's an incredibly powerful tool that has taken root in government systems.
Fantastic. Thank you, Stefania.
Thank you very much for having me here today. We are IMF, an organization that, as a mandate, we are the guardian of macroeconomic stability, and fiscal policy is is really one important instrument for macroeconomic stability, growth, and generating with that jobs for all citizens. But the fiscal policy can also be a potent tool for addressing gender inequality. And that in substance is the concept of gender budgeting. And gender budgeting really is not just the focus on policies, but also on institutions, on the formation of the budget, the implementation, the monitoring from all the like public financial management angle. And at the IMF, we support gender budgeting from and fiscal policy for gender to address and tackle gender inequality through both surveillance at the cross-country level and at the bilateral level with countries, and through helping country with capacity building. So in terms of our work, our analytical and policy work, just as an example that our managing director mentioned yesterday, this is a paper that came out, was published yesterday, and analyzed how policies that are meant to tackle gender inequality drill through the economy, and how important are these also to tackle economic growth, poverty, and inequality. And this is an example of work that we have done. At the country level, we do in our surveillance work, that is the annual consultation with country. We have also dealt with several aspects of gender, and also looking, for example, in country like Rwanda, in Canada, so different income level, different development, how they have their, and analyzing their, the outcome of their budget applications. And last but not least, in capacity building, we provide technical assistance, and we have done in the context of public financial management. Recent example are Ethiopia, Togo, Albania, and we have provided in 2019 about 5 workshops, including to 52 countries, including in the MENA region.
Fantastic, thank you. I'll ask you, I read the paper yesterday and I'll ask you more about it later, but before I do, Zora, according to a 2016 survey by the OECD, it was found that countries have taken many forms when implementing gender-responsive budgeting. Can you perhaps tell us what forms exist today? And you also mentioned in your definition of gender budgeting that you look at impact. What are some key principles that governments should follow to ensure that they achieve impact?
Great. I think that characterization is very accurate. Gender-responsive budgeting does take different forms across the world, and I think that largely comes out from its genesis. So countries have been implementing and experimenting, I would say, with gender-responsive budgeting for many, many years. And in some countries, it's come out of the women's movement. So it's women's organizations who have driven gender budgeting. In other countries, it's come out from the finance ministry. So the finance ministry issues budget guidelines and so on. And yet in other countries, it's come from national women's machineries. So because of these diverse starting points for gender budgeting, we see a range of diverse practices. And I think what's been very good in the past couple of years is all of our attempts, the IMF, UN Women, the World Bank, the OECD and others, is to start systematizing gender-responsive budgeting. So to start looking at what you define as those key principles for gender budgeting across countries, irrespective of where they are in terms of their economic growth. So something that I'd like to bring your attention to in this group is work that UN Women has been doing on developing an international standard for GRB. And this is in the framework of the Sustainable Development Goals. So it's an indicator within that framework under Goal 5. The indicator is 5C1. I'm sorry to be so technical, but it's incredibly important because this indicator is the only fiscal indicator in the entire SDG monitoring framework that aligns resource allocations to policies and laws. So we have many indicators, fiscal indicators that look at poverty measures and so on, but none really look at what are the laws and what are the policies that a government has in place, and do they allocate the necessary resources to implement these laws? So the indicator itself has three components. The first component looks at the policy and legal framework in a country. So it looks at whether gender policy exists in a country. Has the policy actually been costed? Do we know how much it would take in order to close those gender gaps that we talk about, whether it's about education or whether it's about healthcare or women's labor force participation? So that's the first step. The second step is to look at the entire public finance management system and look at the various entry points for gender equality within that. So that could be budget call circulars, that could be gender markers, gender indicators. How do we actually track that resources are allocated and then actually spent the way they're intended to be spent? And then the final is around measuring the impact and looking at transparency. So when we make these allocations, do we inform citizens of how money has been allocated towards the priorities that we've identified? So for us, it's a super exciting standard because we're seeing a lot of uptake of the standard internationally. So far, we have 72 countries that have reported against this indicator. For sure, the OECD countries, the 34 or so, are incredibly interested in this indicator, and we are working with them now to align their budget surveys to this so that we would have a global database. And I think this really alludes to the principles. The principles really are around consistency, they are around leadership, they are around having good policies in place.
Thank you. Going back to the paper, Kristalina yesterday in her conversation mentioned it, of course, and she was talking about the importance of fiscal policies in advancing the gender discourse. Beyond then now gender responsive budgeting, looking at gender responsive fiscal policies in general, in your experience and based on the paper, which also Stefania has co-authored, can you please tell us which fiscal policies have been more effective in one country relative to the other in advancing gender equality?
Well, the room for policy intervention is large. And IMF research shows that policies are really matter for women's choices in the labor market, independently on their choices between family vis-a-vis like work. That says it clearly depends on the needs, depends on the country, on their development level, the challenges and constraints they face. But what broadly, let's say, we can say that for developing countries, it's really more a matter of creating the opportunity for women. For example, in many developing countries, the education gap is still very large. In developing countries, we have that on average, there are 16 percentage points of difference in terms of education between men and women. So investing in education is very relevant for this country, creating infrastructure that have high return for women, that infrastructure in general have high return in developing country for the entire population. But there are infrastructure like, for example, for safe water. In some countries, women in general spend a lot more time than men fetching water for the household. And for example, in Malawi, from household surveys, we learned that women spend like almost an hour a day, while men spend less than 10 minutes a day to fetching water. So that is time that women could actually use for paid work, right? For being active in economic activity. They are remunerated, which is important for them, not only for the growth of the country, but for the households itself, for the well-being of everybody. So other policies instead are more relevant let's say for advanced economies, it's more a matter of balancing the family and the work duties and find the right balance with that. So policies that look at, example, providing subsidized childcare, helping with parental leave, or also policies that don't penalize the secondary earner, which is usually women.
Yes.
So doing a shift toward, for example, for the personal income tax, to filing instead of household, filing individual. If the secondary earner gains a lot less, that would make a more fair balance, because the secondary earner at that point would apply the rates that are more for that own income and not the accumulate of the family. So this creates incentive for all women. And this is important for not only for female labor force participation, but also for growth, for aggregate productivity.
I think it was mentioned, a very important statistic that was mentioned yesterday is that if we achieve balance, 50-50 in the economy, our wealth grows by $172 trillion. So that's completely untapped potential and opportunity here. I want to move to our next question, which goes to both of you, Stefania and Zora. In 2015, the 2030 Agenda was launched. And the 2030 Agenda is an extremely important one because SDG 5, gender equality, constitutes a goal, but at the same time, it's also a means of implementation. So all of the other 16 goals also include targets about women. But this also means that now governments are under increasing pressure to deliver on socioeconomic and environmental objectives at the same time. So, and as a result of that, we've seen that there's a rise in what we call thematic budgeting. So gender responsive budgeting is one type of thematic budgeting, but we're also hearing about climate budgeting and pro-poor budgeting and child budgeting, and the list goes on. The question is, to what extent are there synergies and trade-offs between these two or these various multidimensional policies, or is it just trade-offs? How can we manage the co-benefits of all of these to advance all of these agendas simultaneously?
Thanks, Noor. That's an excellent question, because I think if you look at the 2030 Agenda, it really is about coherence. It's about coherence of policies across the agenda. And I think sometimes governments are not that good at policy coherence. It can be very challenging. It's challenging because of the way in which governments are structured. Different ministries, different departments, and so on have different mandates and tackle
also
different
so many
issues.
stakeholders involved.
Exactly, indeed. So for me, I think that I don't see these different types of budgeting at all as competing with each other. I see them as completely synergistic. We know, for example, that when we look at issues of climate change, women are more vulnerable to climate change than men, simply because of where they are in terms of their roles in the reproductive economy, in the formal economy, and so on. So to me, having climate budgeting that is gender responsive is just smart budgeting. It's smart policy and it's smart budgeting because it's taking care of several development problems or issues within one intervention, and I think that's incredibly powerful. Having said that, I don't think the UN is particularly good at coherence itself, or the specialized agencies for that matter, because I think sometimes we tend to promote particular approaches or types of budgeting. So we at UN Women, as the lead, as a system lead on gender budgeting, we're working very hard to bring coherence to the UN system also in these different forms of budgeting. So UNICEF, for example, has a lot of expertise on children's budgeting. UNDP has a lot of expertise on pro-poor budgeting and intersectional budgeting too, right? So looking at how women or how poor people experience multiple and intersecting vulnerabilities and trying to find means within the budget to address these. So we have been working very hard with these entities to make sure that the policy advice that we're giving to governments as the UN system is indeed coherent. So it takes into account how these different forms intersect, and it also makes it easier then for governments to go about designing budgeting approaches that can solve multiple development problems. And so just by way of example from our own work in Vietnam, we are strengthening women's farmers' resilience to climate change through looking at crop diversification. So that is really looking at using gender budgeting, looking at how gender budgeting is applied to the agriculture budget, but also addressing a very pertinent issue around climate change, an issue that is affecting these women farmers on a day-to-day basis. So I think coherence and bringing together policy is incredibly important, and really not to see it as competing. I think that's the way to go.
Thank you, Zora. Coherence is indeed an important, very important topic. Stefania.
I fully agree with Zora's principle of coherence. And with that, I would add that, as we know, policymakers, like you said, have to juggle many goals. And most of the time in very tight fiscal environments and with limited resources. So one point, and this is one of the main messages of our new paper, is it's very crucial to have an assessment from the onset of impact of different policy and different proposals, because these inform the design of policy that we want them to be effective and efficient and taking into consideration the different synergies and the different targets. So it's very important to assess how these policies drill down and affect the economy and the social situation of the country and the climate. So in our paper, what we focus is exactly that, and try to shed some light on how the different policies that are very often adopted by different countries can actually have economic and distributional impact. For example, and here we see the different modality. There are policies that are more pro that, like education, they build education to close the gender gap. They build female human capital, and that would raise aggregate productivity and will really shape for the future productivity and in turn sustainable growth. So if a country really all countries have to target growth, right? But some countries need it more than others. So, or is a more urgent. At the same time, education takes time. So we have other measures that, for example, targeting poor women with cash transfer that have an impact, a more immediate impact on poverty. That could be maybe another immediate target that other countries may have, or reducing inequality. So there are measures that really target create more incentive opportunity for part of the population, like in advanced economies, for example, daycare, subsidize their care. This is a measure that, in our analysis, it's create more incentive for low-income women. They usually have larger families, and for which, in relative terms of their income, the costs are very high of daycare. So for that, women will have a much larger effect on inequality and poverty if they get remunerated jobs.
Definitely.
So really the bottom line is fiscal policy can have gender responsive fiscal policy have important effect on growth inequality, but they have different modalities and different timing, because the time horizon also matter. So a combination of them depends really on the government goals and assessment from the onset of all proposal, all policies is imperative for all policymakers.
We still have 10 minutes, so I'm conscious about time. I'd like to ask you two more questions before I will open it to the audience for questions. So if we could keep just the answers a little bit shorter so that the audience can get the chance to ask us some questions. Zora and Stefania, Zora mentioned that climate change has put women in a more vulnerable position, but also there is timing, and today we're talking about technological advances, and these are also putting women, unfortunately, in a more vulnerable position. We're talking about machine learning, artificial intelligence, and according to the IMF's most recent research, 180 million jobs are at high risk of being displaced because of automation in the next 2 decades. And these are jobs that affect women, unfortunately. How can gender-responsive budgeting help endow women with these skills? Have we seen any examples globally?
Okay, new technology we know are shaping the way we do work, and as such, we have to adapt and to keep up with the changing world. Women in science, like in STEM science, engineering, and technology, are underrepresented. Not in this country, apparently in the Emirates, it's much higher.
70%.
70%.
Very proud of the number.
But in general, around the world, in developing country, but also in developed country, women in STEMs are underrepresented. And these are the science that we expect to have and create future jobs, right? So there is a lot of room for policies, for fiscal policy to work on that. There are countries that support, explicitly have program support for women, for keeping women in STEM education, to provide them in STEM education, like Japan, like Italy, my own country, US. They have specific programs for that. We have in developing countries, for example, providing access to technology, building infrastructure. Government have a big role in that. I just bring up very quickly the example of Nigeria. Nigeria is 70% of women are employed. The rural sector, which is large, 70% are women. But women are, unfortunately, 40% less productive than men. And so the government have started a program with the aim of training in more modern agriculture methods 30,000 women, and also have programs to distribute cell phones so they have access to e-wallets and means to get input, and also to exchange information, to get information. So these are very important programs. Rwanda has introduced the gender dimension in many of their policies, and they have adopted and embraced gender budgeting more broadly. And also in the ICT, they have introduced the gender angle. So these are policies the government can really
Absolutely,
work
thank
on.
you. Zora, usually when we talk about gender responsive budgeting, we focus on the finance ministries. Now, if we look at developing countries, unfortunately, they are facing many budgetary challenges and limitations for various reasons. But this is affecting an important source of funding, which is aid. Yesterday, Her Excellency Hassa Abu Hamid mentioned that the UAE has an initiative called the 100% Women, in which they will be integrating gender equality in all of their bilateral and multilateral aid. Can gender responsive budgeting be, the tools and strategies be used in the context of aid modalities?
I believe it can, and we've seen many examples across the world where it has been used. Often when we talk about gender budgeting, we talk about it as being more effective and efficient budgeting. And I think that if we want to see more efficient and effective aid spending, then we should indeed be integrating gender responsive budgeting much more effectively into new aid modalities. Well, they're not that new anymore, some of them are old. But it's very interesting to me when you look at countries like Bangladesh and Uganda that get a fair amount of direct budget support. These are also countries that have very established gender responsive budgeting mechanisms in place. So Uganda, for example, a sector ministry, when they present their budget proposals to the finance ministry, if it's not fully gender compliant, they don't get what's called a gender certificate, and they have to go back and redefine their objectives and redefine their spending plans and then go back to the finance ministry. So if there's money coming in through direct budget support, then ideally that money is, because there's a good system in place, being used to advance gender equality goals. So I think it is an incredibly powerful instrument to use to make aid more effective. But I just want to point out a stat, and this is a stat from the OECD that's incredibly important and very telling about bilateral aid. And it says that between 2016 and 2017, the OECD DAC reports that financing for gender equality reached a high of 44.8 billion on average. But this was largely concentrated on projects where gender equality was secondary objectives, and only a factor of that actually went to gender equality as a primary objective. So if insufficient money in terms of bilateral aid is going to gender equality, to my mind, you absolutely have to make sure that you have the systems in place at the national level to make sure that aid then is channeled appropriately to your gender equality objectives.
Fantastic, thank you. 30 seconds each. Last question. Can you please perhaps share with us key lessons learned that we can share with countries that are thinking of introducing gender-responsive budgeting? And then I'll open it for 2 questions from the audience.
4 things for me. Yeah. Leadership matters. It has to come from the Ministry of Finance. There has to be a clear directive that this is important and this needs to happen. The second is the evidence and data needs to be there. So your stats need to be in place. What is it? What are the critical gender gaps in particular countries, advanced economies, developing countries and so on that you're trying to close, because it does call for a differentiated approach in different countries. You have to have systems in place, and this is what UN Women is trying to systematize, is trying to look across countries, what are the key elements of a system, because you have to be able to follow the money. And just finally, we're seeing that those countries that have implemented gender-responsive budgeting for a long time and are doing well have really stuck with it. So it is a long game. It's not a quick fix. It's a technical exercise, but it's also an incredibly political exercise that requires all kinds of changes, and it takes a long time.
Stefania, 30 seconds. They're looking at me.
I would just add a couple of that. I think a requirement in terms of giving legal status of the gender budgeting is very crucial. The other is align the gender budgeting with other goals, with development, to be consistent and to be realistic with the development plan of the country. And last but not least, do an analysis of the impact from the onset for efficient measures.
Thank you so much. Can we have one question from the audience? Question from the audience? Any questions from the audience?
Hello, hi. Thank you so much for this conversation that is much needed, I believe so. Can you hear me well, or should I? Yes. Okay. So I wanted to ask about the opportunities that are, you mentioned a lot of opportunities when it comes to measuring the stats, knowing what's the gap, and then it's a long-term thing. It's not a quick fix. What can we call as in like the other things that we missed on? Like you mentioned the challenges and everything, but are there other opportunities that could come from the gender responsive budgeting?
I think the 2030 agenda opens up a huge amount of opportunities. It really does, because it calls for government to be working in a way that's coherent, like never before. And it calls for coherence in how we make policies and how we implement those policies and so on. I think that some of the points that Stefania just raised around having gender budgeting embedded in law and so on are critically important. Because once it's embedded in law, then governments have to do it, right? They have to be implementing what's in the legal, what is a legal requirement. So it does, it kind of forces them to be working in a whole of government way. So it's not just about the Ministry of Finance issuing guidelines and there the guidelines die. It really is about sector ministries picking up those guidelines, understanding what it means for them, and it really needs to be working with the national women's machineries in countries that drive that kind of coherence and implementation. I know national women's machineries across the world, they get very bad rap because oftentimes they don't have a lot of influence and they're under-resourced and so on. But we've also seen examples across the world of national women's machineries where they are properly resourced, where they have staff in place, where they have money and so on, that make a tremendous difference to how the national gender equality policies are implemented, and they can really drive gender budgeting forward. So I think that's an opportunity that we need to look at. Empower. Exactly, because they have the mandate, so the mandate is clear. Their mandates in most countries is to lead gender mainstreaming, but they lack the resources, they lack the capacities and so on. So making sure that they're capacitated to do their jobs.
I want to thank our panelists for their contributions. A warm